You know, it's funny how often we find ourselves glued to election coverage, but how many of us can actually explain the systems behind how those elections actually work, especially in other countries?
Yeah,
Today, we're diving into the German election system.
sounds complicated.
Oh, it can be, but that's why we're here. We're digging into this research paper called Understanding the German Election System. And right off the bat, one thing that really stood out was that Germans get two votes in an election.
Votes.
Two votes. What's the deal with that?
Well, you see, in Germany, it's not just about choosing a party. You're also directly electing someone from your local area to represent you in their version of parliament, which they call the Bundestag.
So it's like we vote for our local representative for Congress, and then we vote again for like the president who leads the whole country.
You got it. Think of it kind of like voting for a governor and a senator on the same day, except in this case, it's your local representative and then a party on the national level.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it.
It's a bit different from what we're used to.
It is. So that first vote, the one for your local representative, that's the
Yeah.
Erstim, right?
Exactly.
But then our research paper throws a curveball. It calls the second vote the Zweitstimme, the more important one.
Aha, yes, the Zweitstimme.
Ugh.
Now, this is where you vote for the party that you want to see running the whole country.
So even though you get two votes, the second one for the party is actually the one that really shapes what the government looks like?
Exactly. And it all comes down to this system called proportional representation.
Okay, proportional representation. I feel like I've heard that term before, but to be honest, I need a little refresher.
Basically, it means that the percentage of seats or spots, let's say that a party gets in parliament, directly reflect the percentage of votes they got from the people.
So it's not just about whichever party gets the most votes and then they get to call all the shots?
Right. It's about making sure that even smaller parties still have a say in how the country is run.
So give me an example. How does that actually work in practice?
Let's say there's a party that's not super popular, but they still get 10% of the national vote.
Okay.
With proportional representation, they would then get roughly 10% of the seats in the Bundestag.
That makes sense.
It keeps any single party from having too much power, and it really encourages a multi-party system.
So even if your party isn't the most popular, you can still have a real impact on what happens in government.
Exactly. Now, to keep things from getting too chaotic with tons of tiny parties all vying for power, they do have something called the 5% threshold.
The 5% threshold.
Yeah, basically, a party needs to win at least 5% of the national vote to get any seats in parliament at all.
So it's a way of making sure that the parties that do make it into parliament have a decent level of support from the voters.
You got it. It's about finding that balance, giving smaller parties a chance to be heard while making sure that the government can still actually function.
That's fascinating. So with these two votes and this proportional representation system, things are already getting interesting.
Oh, and this is where things get even more fascinating, because this two-vote proportional representation system leads to one very important thing: coalitions.
Coalitions. Okay, so now we're really getting into the weeds of how German politics actually work.
You could say that.
It's got to be a wild ride with all these different parties trying to figure out how to actually govern together.
Well, it definitely keeps things interesting.
Yeah.
You see, because of this proportional representation system we talked about, it's actually pretty rare for one single party to win like a huge majority of the seats in the Bundestag.
Okay.
So that means to actually form a government and get things done, they almost always need to team up with another party, or sometimes even multiple parties.
So instead of it being like winner takes all, it's more like let's all try to work together even if we don't agree on everything.
Exactly. And all of that negotiating and compromising leads to a more moderate kind of politics where different viewpoints actually have to be considered.
I guess in a way it forces those parties to find some common ground.
Exactly. It's about finding those areas where they can agree and working together to move the country forward.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, but let's be real for a second.
Okay.
Doesn't this whole coalition thing mean that things move super slow in German politics?
You bring up a good point.
I mean, with all those voices at the table, I imagine it takes a lot longer to reach a decision on anything.
That's a fair assessment.
So is that just the trade-off? Like, do they sacrifice speed and efficiency for stability?
It's definitely a trade-off.
Yeah.
But look at it this way. The German system prioritizes finding consensus and creating stability over like these drastic or radical changes that can happen when one party has all the power.
So it's like a slow and steady approach to governing.
You could say that. It's about building a system that's resilient and less prone to like sudden swings in one direction or another.
That's actually a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, it definitely has its pros and cons.
It does. But I'm starting to see how this whole system with the two votes and the coalitions, how it all fits together.
It's all connected.
Okay, so let's switch gears for a moment and imagine we're German citizens heading to the polls.
Right.
We've got our two ballots. How are we deciding who to support?
Well, remember that first vote, the Erststimme, that's for your local representative, the person you want to actually represent your community in the Bundestag.
Right, so you might vote for someone who you think will fight for the issues that are important in your town or your city.
Exactly, like maybe they're really passionate about improving local schools or public transportation, those kinds of things.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about that second vote, the Zweitstim, the one that has more weight on the overall makeup of the government?
Ah, that's where it gets really interesting. You see, you might love your local representative and everything they stand for, but maybe you don't necessarily agree with every single policy of their party on the national level.
So you could potentially vote for two different parties on the same ballot.
Absolutely. The system is designed to give voters that flexibility.
That's kind of amazing. It seems like German voters really need to be on top of their game to make the most of that system.
I think that's one of the really cool things about it. It encourages people to be informed and engaged, to think about the issues both locally and nationally.
So it's not just about blindly voting along party lines.
Not at all. It's about making those choices, strategically understanding the nuances of each party's platform, and figuring out what aligns with your own values.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this German election system is considered so unique. It's complex, but it makes you think.
Exactly. And you know what else is going to be interesting?
Right.
These upcoming elections, they're shaping up to be pretty significant. Our research paper highlights a few key issues that are going to be front and center in voters' minds this time around.
Oh, yeah, like what? What are German voters most concerned about these days? I bet climate change is a big one, right? I mean, Germany has this reputation for being really eco-conscious, but at the same time, they've got a huge industrial sector, too.
You're absolutely right. It's a real balancing act for them. They've been pushing hard for these ambitious climate goals, investing a ton in renewable energy sources,
Hmm.
but there's always that concern about keeping their economy competitive,
Yeah.
you know?
Totally. It's like trying to be a global leader in green technology without putting the brakes on your own economic growth.
Exactly. And it's not just climate change they're dealing with. The whole global economy is kind of a wild ride these days, right?
For sure.
Globalization, digital disruption, this whole shift towards greener economy. I
Yeah.
mean, these are things that affect everyone, and Germany's no exception.
So those economic anxieties that we're seeing pop up in different parts of the world, Germany's facing those too.
Absolutely. And that means voters there are going to be looking for some reassurance, you know?
Like who's got a plan to navigate all this uncertainty, right?
Exactly. Now, on top of all that, let's not forget about Germany's social welfare system.
Right. Germany's known for having a really strong social safety net.
And they're really proud of that.
Yeah.
It's a core part of their identity. But like any system, it's got its pressure points, you know?
Yeah, like what kind of pressure points are we talking about?
Well, an aging population, for one thing, that always puts a strain on things.
Hmm.
And then there's the rising cost of healthcare. That's a global issue, but it's definitely a factor in Germany.
So it's about finding that balance again, right? Trying to maintain these social programs that people rely on without bankrupting the country.
Exactly. It's a tough needle to thread. And then, of course, there's immigration.
Yeah, that's become such a major topic pretty much everywhere.
And Germany's no different. They've seen a lot of immigration in recent years, which has led to a lot of debate about, integration and what it means for their society.
It's like this huge, complex issue with so many different angles.
Absolutely. You've got concerns about border control, the impact on jobs and housing, how to make sure that newcomers are integrating well into society. It's a lot to grapple with.
It sounds like it. So German voters going into these elections, they've got a lot on their plates.
They do. But you know what? I think that's what makes this whole system so fascinating.
What's that?
It forces people to really engage with the issues. They can't just vote along party lines. They have to think critically about what they believe in, both locally and nationally.
It's like this crash course in democracy.
Exactly. And it reminds us that these challenges that Germany's facing, they're not unique to Germany. These are issues that democracies all over the world are wrestling with.
It's like we're all in this together trying to figure out how to move forward in a world that just keeps getting more complex.
Well said. It's about finding those solutions that work for everyone. And that takes a lot of listening, a lot of dialogue, and a willingness to compromise.
Absolutely. Well, hey, I've got to say, I always learned so much from these deep dives. Thank you for walking us through all the ins and outs of the German election system. It's way more interesting than I think a lot of people realize.
Anytime. It's a topic I'm really passionate about, so
Well,
I'm glad we could dig into it.
and for you, our listener, we'll leave you with this. Knowing what you now know about how Germany approaches elections, do you think a similar system with its emphasis on proportional representation and coalitions could work in other countries? Would it lead to more balanced and representative governments, or potentially just create more gridlock? It's a question worth pondering. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the subjects that matter to you. We'll catch you on the flip side.